The ballroom of the Whitmore estate shimmered with golden chandeliers and polished marble floors, an architectural statement of generational wealth. The air buzzed with soft classical music, crystal flutes clinking, and the hum of whispered business deals disguised as small talk. Amara Collins stepped through the grand doors in a fitted emerald gown that seemed to catch every light in the room. She carried herself with a grace that years of boardroom battles had taught her, the kind of poise that made silence fall when she entered. Yet as her heels clicked across the floor, she felt the weight of eyes following her. Some were curious, some skeptical, and others openly disapproving. It wasn't her success. They doubted her company's numbers were splashed across every business headline that year, and her name had become synonymous with daring innovation. What unsettled them was who she was. A black woman CEO, walking into a legacy space carved and controlled by families like the Whitmores. She had come to finalize the partnership that would push both empires into a groundbreaking $900 million deal. Instead, she found herself wading through an ocean of polite smirks and conversations that stopped as soon as she drew near. Julian Whitmore stood near the long oak table where cigars and brandy were offered, his tailored suit clinging to the sort of arrogance money breeds from birth. He was the heir apparent of the family business, the man whose signature mattered nearly as much as his father Richard's. His voice was smooth, but his words dripped with dismissal when Amara approached. "Well," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "I didn't realize tonight's guest list extended beyond the usual crowd. Brave of you to step into this circle, Miss Collins." The mocking emphasis on brave landed sharper than the champagne bubbles dancing in the glass she held. She did not flinch. She had faced closed doors before, men who mistook her presence for intrusion, investors who questioned her every move while praising less capable men. She smiled, the kind of smile that refused to break even under insult. "It's Mrs. Collins," she corrected softly, her voice calm but firm. "And I don't step into circles, I build them." Her response earned a ripple of murmurs across the room, some admiring, others scandalized. But Julian only smirked, swirling his glass as if she were a punchline. The night continued like a performance in which she was cast as both lead and target. The Whitmore family matriarch made comments about how refreshing it was to see diversity in such settings, while one of Julian's cousins wondered aloud if Amara's company could keep up with a family whose influence had run Wall Street for decades. Richard Whitmore, the patriarch, stood silent. His silence was the loudest voice of all, signaling not approval, not disapproval, just a calculated detachment. It was as though he had already decided to let his son's arrogance run unchecked, watching like a spectator at a play instead of the chair of a billion-dollar empire. Amara's glass remained half full all evening, but her patience thinned with each passing comment. Every question felt less about business and more about her worth, her right to stand in that room. The moment reached its breaking point when Julian leaned closer, his tone deliberately condescending. "I suppose it must be overwhelming, Mrs. Collins, to be negotiating numbers like these. $900 million, it's not exactly a boutique shop deal, is it?" His words sliced into the crowd, followed by laughter that pricked her skin like needles. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Amara could feel her pulse against her collarbone, could hear the faint strains of the violin in the distance fighting against the cruelty of the moment. Then she inhaled, steady and slow, as though drawing courage from the air itself. She placed her glass gently on a tray carried by a passing waiter and lifted her chin. Her eyes locked with Julian's, unshaken. "Overwhelming," she said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the guests who had been listening in. "The only thing overwhelming tonight is arrogance mistaken for intelligence." The laughter in the room faltered, breaking like glass dropped to the floor. Her words hung in the air, commanding a silence that no chandelier or string quartet could distract from. Without waiting for a response, she turned gracefully, her emerald gown flowing like liquid strength, and walked toward the exit. Guests shifted aside as she passed, some offering sympathetic nods, others avoiding her gaze altogether. She did not need their approval, nor their pity. What she carried with her was far greater, the quiet thunder of self-respect. Outside, the night air wrapped around her like a balm. The Whitmore mansion loomed behind her, glittering but hollow, a monument to a world that believed it could belittle her into silence. She descended the steps slowly, each one measured, as though she were leaving behind not just a party, but an entire legacy of dismissal. Her driver opened the sleek black car door, but before sliding inside, she glanced back one last time. Through the grand windows, she could still see the shadows of laughter, the silhouettes of people clinging to old ways. She whispered to herself, not bitterly but with quiet resolve, "Dignity isn't for sale." As the car pulled away, the city stretched ahead, its towers of glass and steel reflecting the lights of possibilities that were still hers to command. The gala might have been their stage, but the world was hers, and she had just chosen not to play their script. Somewhere in the depths of the Whitmore estate, Julian might still be smirking, and Richard might still be silent, but Amara knew that silence could not bury truth forever. The insult had been witnessed. The seed of consequence had been planted, and she, with her head held high, was already moving toward the moment it would bloom. The morning after the gala, headlines flooded the business press, but they were not the headlines the Whitmores had anticipated. Instead of celebrating an impending $900 million partnership, journalists and commentators dissected the chilling silence that had followed Julian Whitmore's condescending remarks toward Amara Collins. The whispers from the marble ballroom had seeped out into the wider world, traveling through the chatter of guests who repeated the story with their own embellishments. The power of gossip became the spark of a firestorm, and soon, the story broke into the mainstream media. Amara awoke to a flood of notifications, her phone vibrating relentlessly with messages of concern, admiration, and outrage. Videos had already begun circulating online, grainy recordings taken discreetly by guests who couldn't resist capturing the moment Julian had delivered his insult. The clip of him sneering about overwhelming sums of money replayed across social media feeds, paired with her calm but devastating response. The caption on one viral post read, "The Queen of Composure shuts down arrogance with grace." Millions watched, commented, and shared the video within hours. What had been intended as humiliation turned into an emblem of dignity and strength. Inside the Whitmore estate, chaos brewed. Richard Whitmore convened an emergency family meeting, his sharp gaze scanning the faces of his children. The patriarch had remained silent at the gala, calculating as always, but now the calculations no longer added up. Investors were calling. Journalists were camped outside their offices. Long-standing allies wanted explanations. And the worst blow of all, the board members of Whitmore Holdings had begun questioning whether Julian's leadership trajectory was a liability. Julian, however, dismissed it all with a shrug, leaning back in his chair as if the world still bent around him. "It's a storm in a teacup," he said arrogantly. "People will forget. They always do. By next week, they'll be begging to cover the signing of the deal." But his sister, Eleanor, who had always been sharper than him, though overshadowed by tradition, interjected. "You don't understand, Julian. The video is everywhere. People aren't just angry at you, they're questioning our values. That deal with Collins Enterprises isn't just about money anymore. It's about reputation." Meanwhile, Amara prepared herself for a decision that would send waves through the financial world. Her advisors urged her to proceed carefully. $900 million was not a figure to dismiss lightly. It was the kind of partnership that could secure generations of stability. Yet when she sat in her office, the city skyline stretching endlessly outside her window, she knew the truth. What mattered more than money was what she represented, not just for herself, but for every young entrepreneur watching, every marginalized voice waiting to see if she would bend or stand tall. She called a press conference. The announcement sent reporters scrambling, eager to witness what they suspected would be an earth-shaking statement. Cameras flashed as she entered the room, dressed in a navy suit that carried the authority of her position and the calm strength of her conviction. She stepped to the podium, her notes resting lightly in her hand, though she barely glanced at them. Her voice filled the space with quiet power. "I was invited to the Whitmore Gala as a potential partner, not as a token, not as a spectacle. What transpired that evening was not business. It was prejudice wrapped in arrogance. I stand before you today to say that Collins Enterprises will not move forward with the proposed $900 million deal. Dignity is not a bargaining chip. Respect is not negotiable. We will not compromise our values for numbers on a page. The room erupted in questions, microphones shoved toward her as journalists clamored for more. But she had said what needed to be said. She repeated calmly, "Our partnerships will reflect not just profit, but principle." Then she stepped away, leaving the words to echo across every channel and news feed. The fallout was immediate. Shares of Whitmore Holdings began to slip as hashtags trended worldwide. Dignity over deals and Stand with Amara became rallying cries, while footage of Julian's smirk replayed endlessly with captions mocking his arrogance. Boycotts formed swiftly, targeting Whitmore products, hotels, and investments. Celebrities, politicians, and grassroots leaders alike chimed in, praising Amara's decision as an act of courage. For many, she became a symbol not just of business success, but of the power to demand respect in spaces designed to exclude. Within the Whitmore boardroom, the atmosphere grew toxic. Richard sat at the head of the table, his face carved in stone, as board members voiced their concerns. One by one, they condemned Julian's behavior, pointing to the financial hemorrhage and public outrage. "We are being dragged under by his recklessness," one director said. "This company was built on influence, and now influence is slipping away." Reluctantly, Richard announced that Julian would be suspended from his duties pending review. Julian erupted in fury, slamming his hand on the polished mahogany table, but his protests were drowned out by the cold reality of numbers and reputations collapsing around him. Amara, meanwhile, found her inbox overflowing with new opportunities. Companies that once hesitated to approach her now extended their hands, eager to align themselves with her brand of leadership. Offers came from firms across Europe, Asia, and Africa, firms that valued not just her innovation but her courage. Collectively, the value of those offers far exceeded what she had walked away from with the Whitmores. It was poetic, the kind of irony that seemed too perfect to script, yet it was real. By refusing to compromise, she had gained far more than money could measure. The city itself seemed to hum differently in the weeks that followed. Billboards displayed her image alongside quotes from her speech. Young professionals whispered her name in coffee shops, their voices carrying admiration and hope. Parents showed their children clips of her standing at the podium, reminding them that strength comes not from fitting in, but from standing firm. She had not just canceled a deal, she had set a new standard for what business could look like when integrity was non-negotiable. Yet beneath the applause and partnerships, she remained grounded. In quiet moments, she still thought of the night at the Whitmore mansion, the laughter, the silence, the sting of words meant to belittle. It could have broken her. Instead, it had become the very fire that fueled her. She knew the fight was not over. Julian Whitmore was not a man who would accept defeat quietly, and the world had not yet seen the depth of his bitterness. But for now, she allowed herself the smallest smile, one of quiet triumph. The humiliation they had intended had only magnified her strength, and the deal they thought defined her had crumbled into dust at her command. Months later, the business world still buzzed with the aftershocks of the canceled Whitmore deal. Amara Collins had transformed from a powerful CEO into a global icon, her name etched into conversations far beyond the financial pages. She was no longer just a figure in boardrooms. She had become a cultural force, a living reminder that power did not belong only to those born into dynasties of privilege. Invitations to conferences and panels arrived daily, yet one stood out among them all: the Global Leadership Summit, an annual gathering of the world's most influential leaders. The invitation letter read, "We believe your voice is the voice the world needs to hear right now." The Whitmores, on the other hand, were in freefall. Boycotts continued to drag down their stock, partnerships dissolved under the weight of public outrage, and whispers of internal betrayal circled their empire like vultures. Richard Whitmore had grown haggard, his once unshakable posture bent under pressure. His son Julian remained defiant, insisting the world had overreacted, but the numbers and headlines proved otherwise. The board had formally removed him from daily operations, citing his conduct unbecoming of a representative of Whitmore Holdings. For a man who had lived his life shielded by wealth and entitlement, it was a humiliation deeper than he could bear. Amara prepared for the summit with the same calm focus that had guided her from the very beginning. Her team reminded her of the stakes. Representatives from nearly every major economy would be present, along with cameras broadcasting to millions worldwide. But she was not nervous. The humiliation she had endured at the Whitmore mansion had already been her greatest test. Compared to that, standing on a stage felt like a natural continuation of the journey she had chosen. When the day arrived, the summit's main hall gleamed with banners, its stage framed by flags of every nation. Leaders in suits and gowns filled the seats, their voices low but expectant. When Amara walked onto the stage, the applause was thunderous, reverberating like a wave across the hall. She stood behind the podium, the lights warm against her face, and for a brief moment, she thought of the night she had walked out of the Whitmore Gala with nothing but her dignity. That night had seemed like a loss. Yet here she was proof that what others tried to break could instead be reforged into strength. Her speech was not a lecture, but a story, woven with honesty and vulnerability. She spoke of being underestimated, of walking into rooms where eyes doubted her before her voice had even begun. She recounted the night at the Whitmore estate, not with bitterness but with clarity, painting the picture of how silence can wound as deeply as words. She described the moment she chose to walk away from $900 million, the weight of that choice, and the freedom it gave her. "Money builds empires," she said, her voice steady. "But integrity builds legacies. And legacies outlive empires." The hall erupted in applause, standing ovations sweeping through row after row. Some leaders wiped their eyes discreetly, others clapped until their palms burned. Her words traveled instantly across live streams, translated into dozens of languages, tweeted, shared, and quoted around the world. For millions watching from their living rooms, coffee shops, and offices, Amara became more than a CEO. She became a teacher of resilience, a guide for anyone who had ever been told they did not belong. As her influence rose, so too did the opportunities. Partnerships with firms that shared her values multiplied, each more lucrative and prestigious than the last. Universities invited her to mentor future leaders, charities sought her patronage, and grassroots organizations drew strength from her example. Collins Enterprises, once on the brink of tying itself to the Whitmores, now commanded a network of alliances that far exceeded the original deal's worth. What had started as an insult had turned into a revolution. Julian, however, spiraled into obscurity. Headlines chronicled his downfall, from failed attempts at starting new ventures to his estrangement from the family empire. He appeared occasionally in tabloids, his arrogance now reduced to bitter interviews where he blamed cancel culture for his misfortune. Yet the world had moved on, uninterested in his excuses. Even Richard, once a towering figure of control, bowed to the inevitable restructuring of the company. Whitmore Holdings, once untouchable, fragmented into smaller divisions, its glory days buried under scandal. One evening, as Amara prepared for another speaking engagement, she sat quietly by her window overlooking the city skyline. The lights flickered like stars scattered across steel towers, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself a long exhale. The world had celebrated her, lifted her, and crowned her with titles she had never asked for. But in her heart, she knew the victory had never been about global stages or roaring applause. It had been about the choice to protect her dignity, to prove that respect mattered more than wealth. Her phone buzzed with a message from her assistant, reminding her of the next morning's flight. She smiled faintly, slipping the phone aside. Her thoughts wandered to the countless young women watching her journey unfold, women who might one day walk into rooms like the one she had walked out of. She hoped they would remember her story and know that they, too, could choose to walk away with their heads high. Amara closed her eyes and whispered softly into the quiet room. This is what true power feels like. Not control, not domination, but freedom. The freedom to define her worth without waiting for permission. She had turned humiliation into triumph, arrogance into accountability, and a canceled deal into a global lesson. The Whitmores had believed they were untouchable, but the truth had touched them all the same. And so her story settled into the world like a seed, planted in boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms alike. A story of dignity standing taller than money. A story that reminded everyone watching that arrogance may dazzle for a season, but integrity endures forever. Moral lesson. In the end, Amara's story carried more than business lessons. It carried a gentle reminder for every heart listening. Life will always place us in rooms where prejudice and arrogance test our worth. Yet, as Amara showed, it is not wealth or applause that defines us, but the quiet courage to walk away when dignity is threatened. True strength lies not in holding power over others, but in holding onto our own self-respect. You've got TH. Is a currency the world cannot devalue. Like this story, subscribe, share, and comment on your lesson.